Good morning, my name's Reed. I'm with SouthAtlantic Diesel. Today we're going to be doing a TerraClean SouthAtlantic Diesel service on this Detroit DD15, and I'm going to kind of explain and go through how the process works and what we do. First off, my man Trevin here has already unhooked the DD. We've got the piping, so we hook in somewhere usually between the EGR and the cooler. On the exhaust side, we'll push our foam while the truck's idling against the exhaust flow into the back of the cooler to the front, then down to the exhaust manifold where it'll go into the turbo, clean the fins, the VGT, break down any soot buildup that's there, and it moves it, liquefies it, and moves it down into the DPF filter and sits there in a liquid state and waits for a regen. When we clean the intake, we push our foam in there, it'll go into the intake. If a grid heater, it'll clean the grid heater, it'll clean the tops of the cylinders, it'll clean the outside of the injectors, and our product, when it's mixed with a flammable like diesel, it burns once we have combustion. So on the intake side, once we get the pressure and the combustion going on, that's as far as we clean. On the exhaust side, my product sits and waits for us to dump diesel fuel into the DPF so we can do a regen. So today, this truck had an EGR issue. We're going to clean it. The amazing part of TerraClean is we're able to clean the entire after treatment system in one swoop. So we're able to clean the EGR, the cooler, the exhaust side of the turbo, the DPF, including all the parts, DOC, SCR, injectors, all that, and all the piping included with it in about an hour and a half. So this service is amazing for a preventative service. You can imagine the cost to repair one of these parts is, or take off and replace one of these parts is multiples of the cost of one of these services to do. So we'll get started here in just a second. Pressurized canister that we run at about 55 pounds of air. We've got our 1 gallon of our TerraClean product, which is here, poured into the tool. It goes in through a 2-line fitting. One holds air, one holds the liquid. As you can see, it follows up here to what is our foamer. So our air comes in, spirals around, mixes with our liquid, and allows it to foam. That way we're not introducing a liquid into the engine while it's running. The foam allows oxygen and air and everything to get in so we can still have good combustion and engine still breathing and running, because this service is run while the truck is in a high idle. As you can see here, we removed the crossover pipe coming from the EGR cooler into the intake. So we've removed it and we've replaced it with our DD13, DD15 fittings, which is one plate and one hose plug in there. So with our manifold adapter that we have, I can nozzle it to intake or to exhaust. I can direct my foam how I want to do. So most trucks, most diesels, the problem is on the exhaust side. So we're going to really focus a lot of our foam on the exhaust. I'm going to probably try to do 2/3 of the foam exhaust, 1/3 intake. I don't want to ignore the intake. I do want to clean that side, but I don't want to waste a lot of the juice on the intake, where the main issue and all the main costly, expensive parts are on the exhaust side. So we're going to crank the truck up. I'm going to start it with my nozzle pointed on exhaust. I've got my product line off at the moment, which is right here. This is the product line. Air line is a nozzle here. That's going to stay on at all times. I've got this off, so once we crank it on and I turn the air pressure on, all I'm doing is blowing air. Once I want to start putting the foam in, I just open my nozzle and that allows the foam to go in. So if you ever need to stop the product going in for any reason, or you walk away, you can just cut this off and you know all you're doing is safely blowing air into the exhaust system. So we'll get started. Let's crank this truck up and get it into a high idle via cruise if possible. All right, so guys, we've already ran 16 ounces through the exhaust, and for training purposes, we cut the engine off so you could hear me. As you notice on our tool, this is our 1 gallon tool. We also have a 1/2 gallon and a 2 gallon tool, but we've got 16 ounce increments, bars on there. So the way I do it, like I said earlier, I try to do 2/3 exhaust, 1/3 intake. So I'll watch the bars and I'll do 2 bars exhaust, and then I'll go to my throttle or my manifold adapter here and I'll switch over to intake. and then I'll keep an eye on it, and I'll just do one bar, which is 16 ounces on the intake, and I'll switch back to exhaust, 32 ounces exhaust. I'll switch back to intake. So the key is you don't want to do one side exhaust and one side intake. It's much more beneficial to go back and forth 3 to 4 times per service. And that reason is the foam's allowed to sit in there, kind of break stuff down, move it, and then when we come back with the air pressure, it can push it down to where it needs to be. It just gives it more time to break down. Again, what we're doing is liquefying the soot, and we're moving it down into the DPF to be burned, or we're putting it into the intake, into the combustion chamber to burn there. So another thing we'll do that I'm going to talk about now, once we get to the second half of our service, when we're on the exhaust side, it's important that it's the exhaust side, and you'll know if you're accidentally doing it on the intake. To clean, our foam is going across the turbo, it's hitting the VGT and the fins, and it's softening up and breaking up any soot. But if you have a lot of buildup on the turbo, you're going to want to put it under a load. So I'll hop in when I'm on the second half of my service, whether it's a 1 gallon service as a preventative, when I'm down to the second half of my 1 gallon, or if it's a 2 gallon service as an initial clean, when I'm on my 2nd gallon, I'll hop into the truck, take it out of high idle where I wanted it, it's staying at 11 to 1300 RPMs where it'll sit nicely. I'll take it out of high idle when I'm on the exhaust side, and I'll mash the accelerator, just give it a good 1 to 2 second mash. I want the turbo to spool and go under a load, so the VGT will actuate and the fins will spin and spool, and it'll break free any type of soot buildup there. I've seen it many a time free up turbos that have been stuck solid for months. So that's another something you want to remember to do. And it's on the second half of the service. You want to spool up the turbo and break free any there, because that's, the VGTs are a major problem, and that's a $4,000 repair there, maybe even more. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to crank the truck back up and start running intake. And then after 1 bar, I'm going to go back and do 2 bars exhaust. While we're running the service, I walked around. Another added benefit of the TerraClean is you're going to find an exhaust leak if you have one. And while we were running the service on the exhaust, I noticed a black puddle of foam dripping down, and I came over and he can see it. Yeah, we've got the crossover tube coming from the EGR cooler to the intake has a complete crack, which this truck came in for an EGR issue, and I can almost guarantee you the cause of the problem is that crack. We've got pressures leaking, soot building up. So another added benefit, which I've seen a lot of times, is this can help diagnose an exhaust leak way quicker than taking it off, smoke testing it, or doing pressure testing it, whatnot. You can find it immediately anywhere in the exhaust system. So until we get it fixed, we know where the issue is, and we'll repair that, and then you clean the service, and the truck should be back running great. While we're running the Detroit that we showed, the service is the same on every type of engine. The only differences for each engine is where you hook in, what fittings you need. You can always go to terraclean.net, and you go to diesel application guide. You can do make, model, and it'll show you the make and model and what fittings go to what. So here we have a Cummins ISB, 6.7 liter Cummins, EGR motor, crossover pipe, cooler over there. So the way we hook into a Cummins, just for knowledge, we would unplug the temperature sensor on the crossover tube, unscrew the temperature sensor, and we would thread our hose in. We also take the 4 bolts, Phillips head screws out of the EGR motor, and we replace it with what I call our manual plunger. So a Cummins at rest, when it's off or has no power to the EGR rests at shut. Unlike the Detroit we're doing, where we have the manifold adapter, where I have 2 fittings and I use the manifold to switch back and forth from intake to exhaust, here on the Cummins we only have 1 point of entry. So to make it to where I can push my foam 2 separate directions, I do that by actuating the EGR. So obviously exhaust, when the truck is idling, is going to try to come from the cooler around through the EGR back across the grid heater into the intake to be combusted. So when I have my hose stuck into the temperature sensor and I'm pushing air pressure, my foam is always going to try to go to the intake side. So as I said, when it's no power to the motor, the EGR is shut. So when I have my plate screwed on there and my screw backed all the way off, I know that my EGR is shut. That allows my foam to go in. It tries to go intake and it hits the shut EGR, and with 50 pounds of air pressure, we're able to push it against the exhaust flow into the exhaust. So it'll go backwards into the cooler, exhaust side of the turbo, and into the filter. When I want to clean the intake side, all I do is I screw my plate, I screw it in, which pushes the EGR open and allows the exhaust or my foam to flow through the EGR into the intake. So that's the only difference, is 1 point of entry on these Cummins, whereas if you have 2 points where you take a plate off and bolt 2 sides, you're going to use the manifold adapter to go exhaust or intake. We have finished our service. What he's doing now is he is unhooking and putting everything back together and getting it ready for regen. So the product is a caustic cleaner. So you got to remember there's causticity to it. They have added what they call a buffer. So as soon as the product is dried, the causticity is eliminated, is neutralized by the buffer. So you do not want this product sitting in the engine. You want to dry it as soon as you can, which what we will do in this case is a regeneration. So when you're done with the service, you want to hook it up, and within 4 to 6 hours, sooner the better, you want to put it into a regen. If the truck has other problems that cause it to not go into a regen, I always recommend to go drive it, put it in a low gear, get it hot, and let it burn out that way. If you don't get it into a regen or burn it, all we've done is we have taken the soot that's in the entire system that was on the EGR and the cooler, the turbo, and we've now moved it into the filter, and within a day or two, our product will evaporate and the soot will reharden, and we've just added a lot more product into the filter. So a regen is very important. What I did when I was done with the service, when I finished on my exhaust and my intake side, before I switch over the other way, I run 2 minutes of air on the exhaust and 2 minutes of air on the intake to kind of blow and move everything down to where it needs to be before I unhook it. Then I just zeroed out my air pressure, cut the truck off, and my man here is hooking it back up. Service is simple, easy to do, just needs to be done correctly. Every step needs to be performed, and a regen is very important.